Hello everyone. As many of you likely know, one of my favorite fiction series of all time is The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. The 5-book series is one that I have read a couple of times now and have really appreciated and gotten a lot more out of it the more that I've read it and the more I've read of the books that have influenced Gene Wolfe before and while he was writing it. So today I thought I would do a video on books that you should read before you read The Book of the New Sun. And the simple answer is really none. You don't need to have any prior reading before you start Book of the New Sun. It stands on its own very well. You can read it just as a story on its own. But there are a couple of books, though, that I will be recommending here that might help you get more out of it. So even though it is a perfectly contained story, you don't need any previous literary science fiction knowledge. Having the context of some other books might amplify your reading experience, might improve it a little bit. And then we'll also talk about a few books that if you're craving a little bit more after you've already completed The Book of the New Sun, here's some books to consider reading afterwards. So we're going to have a few different supplemental reads that we'll go over here. And the first recommendation is going to be The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. And really, this recommendation doesn't come from me. This comes from the man himself, from Gene Wolfe. Gene Wolfe has said that he was highly inspired by this, that The Book of the New Sun is sort of him playing with the Dying Earth setting that Jack Vance established and explored in this quartet. And one of the dangers that we have when talking about a series like Book of the New Sun that takes influence from so many different areas is it's easy to read in influence that isn't there. So this has happened to Gene Wolfe really his whole career, where people would ask like, oh, there's this one passage, were you alluding to this obscure knighting practice that nobody knew about until 10 years ago? And he's like, no, I wrote the books, back in the 80s. Of course I wasn't alluding to that. But because people know of all the influences, it's easy to read some of them into it. The Dying Earth, though, Gene Wolfe has claimed to be an influence. He's been very open about that. And so if you want to get a general idea for what the type of setting is that you will be encountering in his series, the Dying Earth novels are pretty short. They're much more digestible than Book of the New Sun. They're pretty straightforward, whereas Book of the New Sun has a lot more to ponder over, a lot more to process and chew on. The Dying Earth books are pretty self-evident in their presentation, and so if you want to get an idea for the type of story and the type of world that you will get, it's not a bad place to start. The next book that I'm going to recommend here is probably one that most of you are familiar with, but in case you haven't read it, it's Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So Frankenstein plays a big role in Gene Wolfe's quartet, not just in terms of the themes and ideas of being able to create life from nothing, being able to create monsters. Those things are in Book of the New Sun, but also some very direct and specific references. There are some prominent characters in Wolfe's work that very closely mirror Dr. Frankenstein and the creature, the monster that he creates. So having a general familiarity with especially Mary Frankenstein, not just the pop culture's osmosis of Frankenstein, which is very different from the book, but having a specific understanding of Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein, will be helpful in your read of the Book of the New Sun. So I recommend this. If you haven't picked it up, it is worth the read. It's a fairly easy read as far as classics go, and will help improve your reading experience. So definitely a high recommend here. The next is going to be just generally being familiar with some of the work of H.P. Lovecraft. So here we have the Cthulhu mythos. I'm not necessarily going to recommend specific stories by Lovecraft, but generally having an understanding of Lovecraftian horror and the sort of the nihilism that Lovecraft explores in his books, the fear of the unknown, the terror of eldritch entities, is something that will be helpful in understanding some of the more villainous aspects that come up in Book of the New Sun. So this is one where actually cultural osmosis will be helpful, unlike Frankenstein. Even just having a general idea of how Lovecraftian horror, eldritch beings, Lovecraftian entities, what those tend to be, how those tend to be represented, will be helpful when reading Wolfe's work. So that's why it's another recommendation here. The last novel that I will recommend here is actually a trilogy, and that is going to be the Ransom or Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis. So the first book in this is Out of the Silent Planet, second is Paralandra, and the third is That Hideous Strength. So you should read this trilogy just because it's amazing, fantastic, and more people should read it. But if you want to get an idea of the spiritual ideas that Wolfe plays with, if you want to get an idea for some of the supernatural beings that hide behind the curtain in the Book of the New Sun, Lewis plays with some very similar ideas in this trilogy. I don't have specific quotes from Wolfe saying that he was inspired by this, but I know that he read C.S. Lewis, and so this being so similar in some ways to some of the things that Wolfe does in his series, no doubt it was an influence upon Wolfe as well. So the Space Trilogy, each book is very different from the last. The first one is a planetary adventure novel with sort of a metaphysical layer that's hovering underneath the surface. Paralandra is almost a science fiction retelling of the fall from the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve in the garden. And That Hideous Strength is like 1984 with an occultic twist to it, mixed with the Arthurian mythos and some of J.R.R. Tolkien's mythos that is referenced in this C.S. Lewis book before Tolkien even finished The Lord of the Rings. So That Hideous Strength is especially a bizarre book and maybe my favorite from Lewis. And if you want to get a little bit more out of some of the background things, like I said, that Wolfe does, That Hideous Strength is a great place to get some more information on that. But this is probably a little bit less required than some of the other things that are recommended, but I thought I would bring it up because I think it will be helpful to readers to have that as context. The last and most important recommendation in many ways, though, is to just generally be familiar with the Bible. I'm not going to recommend a specific translation necessarily, but especially the New Testament. Being familiar with the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, will be invaluable in gaining a better understanding of the Book of the New Sun. You can read it just as a story on its own. You don't need to look for any deeper spiritual stuff that Wolfe is doing. Wolfe is not writing this to be some sort of heavy-handed allegory. He's not writing this to be a book that makes religious didactic points. But his Catholic beliefs are all throughout the Book of the New Sun. And there are very weird things that will prop up. And unless you have a basic understanding of some of the life of Jesus, some of the miracles of Jesus, it will be very confusing to just somebody picking it up blind. Not to say that you won't understand the story, but you will understand a lot more of why certain characters make the decisions they make if you understand the Gospels, and how certain character actions echo things that are recorded in the New Testament. So having a general understanding of that will be very helpful in reading the Book of the New Sun. But now I'd like to recommend a couple of books that if you've already read Wolfe and you want to get something that kind of whets the appetite, or things that would be helpful reading or help expand your understanding of the Book of the New Sun after you've already completed it, here are a few novels that I would recommend. And the first is going to be Prince of Thorns and the General Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence. Now, I'm going to leave this pretty brief because I already have a video on my channel comparing The Broken Empire to Book of the New Sun, and how I think there's actually some really interesting ways that these two books are in conversation with each other. But I'll say that if Severian is sort of a symbolic savior character in Wolfe's novels, then Jorg Ancrath, the main character of The Broken Empire, is almost a symbolic devil character. This is like reading a fantasy trilogy told from the point of view of the villain. And so many people find it off-putting for that. But if you know that going into it, that you're supposed to be reading this as though Jorg Ancrath is the villain, I think you'll get a lot more out of this. Jorg shares some really shocking similarities to Severian, and there are some very eerie similarities in how their plots progress, and even some of the supernatural things that happen in both of these series. So if you've liked some of the things in Book of the New Sun, I recommend reading Broken Empire. I don't find it as complicated as New Sun. I don't even find as much depth in here, but I found it to be a very interesting read with the context of the Wolfe series. The next book that I'll recommend is The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. So this is a thriller mystery novel that Chesterton wrote, but halfway through the novel, which is sort of a pedal to the metal, fast-paced, almost an action book in many ways, Chesterton turns it and shifts the focus of the story, and you start to see different allegorical points that begin to be pulled out of it. And in many ways, you can see similar points that Wolfe makes as well. Now, Chesterton was also a big influence on Wolfe, and some of the specific aspects with where Severian's arc ends in New Sun, Chesterton explores some similar ideas in The Man Who Was Thursday. Now, The Man Who Was Thursday, as you can see here, is a very short book. It's a very quick read. So this one especially, I would recommend if you finish New Sun, pick this up as well and give it a read. This one could also have gone in the first category as well. You could read this before reading New Sun and get a lot of the same impact, just in the opposite reading order. But I highly recommend The Man Who Was Thursday for Wolfe fans. I think you'll get a lot out of this. Next on the list is going to be the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio. So odds are most people watching this on BookTube will have already heard of the Sun Eater series. Rocchio has definitely been like somebody who's helped spread the gospel of Gene Wolfe, has helped spread the news of him. I picked up Book of the New Sun on his recommendation. I'd heard of it before, but didn't know much about it, and I'm very thankful to Christopher for recommending it. But if you've read New Sun and you liked it and you want more of it, Sun Eater is definitely a series that will help scratch that itch. I think it is overstated how similar the two series are. Because Rocchio is such a fan of Wolfe, the two often get compared, but in terms of the feel, the tone, the atmosphere of the two series, in many ways they couldn't be more different. New Sun is very short and concise. It's these very slim volumes, and Sun Eater is this sprawling 7-book epic space opera story. So they're very different stylistically, but they have similar ideas. And especially Howling Dark, the book that I held up, has some very specific nods to Wolfe throughout it. And Book 6, Disquiet Gods, also has a lot of nods to Wolfe. So if you've read New Sun and you just want more of it, yeah, definitely check out Sun Eater. The first book is not the strongest in the series, so I recommend reading Howling Dark, which is more Wolfian in a lot of ways, but yeah, I recommend the series. And then the last individual novel that I'll recommend here is Pirate Freedom. So there's a lot of criticisms, if you've read Book of the New Sun, of Severian as a character. He has, as I've called here on the channel before, a lot of bad behaviors throughout the series, a lot of things that are less than morally upright. And in many ways, Pirate Freedom almost feels like a response to that in some ways. There are very similar science fiction mechanics in this historical fiction / sci-fi novel, Pirate Freedom, as there are in New Sun. The writing style in Pirate Freedom feels very similar to the prose style of New Sun, which is not true of all of Wolfe's books. Wolfe has a very versatile prose style. Like, he can change it depending on the novel and depending on what the novel calls for. But Pirate Freedom almost seems to intentionally echo the style that Wolfe used in New Sun. And many of the criticisms of sexism in New Sun, many of the voyeuristic aspects of New Sun that some people object to, it seems like Pirate Freedom is written in response to it. So if you were uncomfortable with certain things in New Sun, if you found Severian very unlikable, if you weren't sure, like, should I be rooting for him or not, I'm not saying that Pirate Freedom is a sequel to New Sun, because it's not, but I think thematically there's a lot of similar things here that fans of New Sun will appreciate getting some more clarity on Wolfe as a writer from this book. So I definitely recommend this. And then, of course, the last recommendation here on the list is that the Book of the New Sun is just the beginning of Gene Wolfe's bigger solar cycle, with the next sub-series being Book of the Long Sun. So I'm going to be starting Book of the Long Sun very shortly here. So if you've read New Sun and you want more Wolfian goodness, Long Sun is definitely the place to go. So guys, these are recommendations for books if you've already read New Sun, of some follow-up books to read, but also if you're thinking about getting into it, some books that I recommend just having under your belt or just familiarity with before you read New Sun. So hopefully this was helpful. I know there's a lot of deeper cuts in Wolfe stuff that people recommend. And if you go to the Gene Wolfe subreddit, there's a whole list of books that people recommend for fellow Wolfe fans. But I'm just saying, for me, these were ones that I noticed. These were ones that helped me get more out of the story, or helped expand my understanding afterwards. So I recommend them and wanted to share them. So thank you guys for watching. Take care.